Greetings and welcome to our podcast, Conversations with B'nai B'rith. I'm CEO Dan Mariaschin. In this podcast, we'll go behind the scenes at B'nai B'rith magazine with longtime editor Gene Meyer. But first, a bit of housekeeping. If you enjoy this program, subscribe to Conversations with B'nai B'rith wherever you get your podcasts. And leave us a rating. And you can also subscribe to our YouTube channel and like us on Facebook for all of our latest content. Today, we're here to talk about the winter 2023 edition of B'nai B'rith magazine, a very special Jewish general interest periodical, which has been continuously published by our organization since 1886. But before we go behind the scenes on the most recent issue, I do want to take a moment to commend the entire magazine team for the 2022 issue, which this last June won the top prize at the American Jewish Press Association Rock Hour Awards for Journalistic Excellence. In fact, B'nai B'rith magazine won 3 big awards for the 2022 issue. First place award for General Excellence, Best Magazine. First place award for Excellence in Enterprise or Investigative Reporting for the cover story, Stolen Silver, Nazi Plunder, and the Unfinished Quest for Restitution. And a second place award for excellence in single commentary for Students Tackle the Issue of Modern Anti-Semitism with the None Shall Be Afraid essay contest. Gene, since we've not had you on the podcast since those impressive wins, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge this prestigious recognition.
Well, thank you, Dan. I want to acknowledge the fine work done by our team in-house and also by the many freelance writers who contributed to this issue and helped us achieve these awards. We've had good eclectic covers over the years, and I've been proud to edit everything from Jews in the civil rights movement to Jewish cartoonists, and we did one on anti-social media. We're kind of ahead of the curve there, and even back in 2016, we did a cover story on UNRWA, the United Nations organization that is involved in Gaza and controversy right now. So I think we present a good assortment of articles and subjects to our readers, and we get good feedback. I'm proud to do that.
Great. Well, Gene Meyer is an award-winning journalist who spent more than 3 decades at the Washington Post as a reporter and an editor. He's had more than 50 bylines in the New York Times. He's also written for numerous other publications, including Bethesda Magazine, where he was a contributing editor, U.S. News and World Report, and The Washingtonian. He's the author of 5 for Freedom, the African-American Soldiers in John Brown's Army, and more recently, Hidden Maryland in Search of America in Miniature. Since 2009, Gene has been the editor of B'nai B'rith magazine, which has won many awards under his stewardship, including the most recent ones that I just described. Gene, welcome back to the podcast. So glad to have you with us again.
Thank you, Dan. I'm happy to be here to talk about my favorite magazine.
Well, let's get started. The cover story of the winter 2023 issue, When Anti-Semitism Hits Home, How Hate Hurts Kids, is unfortunately seemingly always current. How did this story come about?
Well, one of our really good writers, Beryl Benderly, who's been primarily a science and medical writer over the years, proposed it to us. And this was over a year ago, and it was a problem, the rising anti-Semitism. And at the time, there were many incidents happening in the schools and close to home in Montgomery County, Maryland. And it seemed that this was an important story. And even though anti-Semitism was rising nationally and affecting all age groups, the question rose, how does this affect kids? And the problem was that kids were hiding their Judaism because they were afraid of being bullied and scapegoated. And it just struck me as a very sad situation. And I was grateful to Beryl for proposing the article, and so that's what we did.
Well, the timing of this piece, of course, is really quite something. Tell us about some of the research for the piece. Were you surprised by the fears of the young people quoted in the story. I mean, since then, and since October 7th, of course, there's been even a further spike. And we've seen on TV many interviews with students from various campuses around the country who feel intimidated and threatened. So, can you comment on the research? How was that all gathered?
Sure. Well, Beryl interviewed students, particularly at the Whitman High School in Bethesda, Maryland, and she interviewed experts and scholars. There is an expert who had done a survey of high school girls in Toronto. It was actually a few years old, but certainly just as relevant. And she talked to a number of teenagers who had either been affected or trying somehow to cope with this new threat. And it's interesting because I look back into my old files. I'd written a story in 1981 in the Washington Post. The headline was "Significant Drop in Anti-Semitism Reported." So these things, come and go, but there seemed to be a new resurgence and really a great increase in incidents, and particularly affecting young people in schools and middle schools and high schools, and since October 7th, even more so on college campuses. So Beryl did all the research and was able to craft together, I think, a pretty good, comprehensive picture, alarming picture, actually. Didn't come to any conclusion other than, it remains to be seen what the real impact, long-term impact of anti-Semitism incidents are on kids. But I think we've seen since October 7th that it's pretty severe and shows no signs of abating at this time.
Yeah, I do want to note that given our publishing deadlines, the story was conceived and written well before the Hamas attacks on October 7th. So not only do I think that the timing here is extremely important, but also that the topic and the conclusions certainly hold up in an important way. So it's really a very important piece and an important contribution to understanding the challenges that our community faces today.
Yes, and I think that it wasn't originally my first choice for the cover, and because I thought, there were so many serious subjects that we've dealt with over the past several years, it would be nice to have a kind of a fun cover, which wound up being a story inside. We'll talk about it in a minute. But Dan rightly said, no, this is front and center. We need to do this. And I think, you were very prescient in suggesting that. So we did make the rise of anti-Semitism and how hate hurts kids the cover story. I'm very glad we did that.
Let's talk about another piece in the issue, very interesting, called Pray Tell, which looks at how congregations rely on innovation and tradition in approaches to worship. Much of the audience for B'nai B'rith magazine certainly is culturally Jewish. Many are observant. Many are observant in other ways. Why present so many different approaches to worship?
Well, I think, it was an informative piece. And even though, we're all under a big tent, we also tend to inhabit our own silos. And that the story really shows that there are many options and many different ways of that Jews in America particularly pray. The writer makes the point that not in America that the predominant form of worship it leans more towards orthodoxy, whereas in the United States there's such a wide range and also evolving. I mean, you have conservative synagogues or even Reform synagogues in some places where people feel more at home wearing kippah and wearing talisim, and you have conservative synagogues, of course, that don't have a divide between men and women, and otherwise are similar to Orthodox. And you have, he writes about a synagogue in California where people have a Shabbat service canoeing, kayaking on the canals in Venice, California. So you have all these options, and the point of the article is really just to show the great diversity in our ways of worship, and not to advocate one or the other, but just to say, we're a big tent, and you might be interested in seeing what other people do, and that's the point of it.
Yeah, the takeaway from the piece seems to be that there is a space and a place for everyone to worship in our community, and I guess that's what you hope that readers will conclude.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
Is it important for people to see how others worship, and could presenting a diverse array of options lead some synagogues to rethink and revisit perhaps the choices and the formats offered to a particular congregation? You think that that's part of the 21st century and where we're headed as a community?
Well, I think that different synagogues explore different options, and in some synagogues the choices are more lay led, and other synagogues the rabbi is more dominant in deciding those issues. And I think that as people learn more about the different kinds of prayer, they can make choices, and they can maybe influence the types of worship that are adopted in their own congregations, or they can look somewhere else if they want to find an alternative.
Well, let's talk now about a story that I was, truth be told, a bit unsure about when we discussed it. Jewish dogs coming of age, the rise of the bark mitzvah. This story is about mitzvah celebrations that some people hold for their dogs. The article did a good job of showing how some think it's frivolous to hold religious ceremonies for their pets, and while others are glad to have any occasion to encourage more people to attend services. How did this story come about, and what do you think some of the takeaways are?
Well, the story was again pitched by a freelance writer, Jen Levy, who's done other stories for us before. And I wasn't aware of it. I guess there were other people. There's actually the head of Dog TV, a man named David Best, and had a bark mitzvah for his pet some years ago. And he was sort of the lead into the story. His dog's name is Elvis. And at first it seemed kind of trivial and funny. And not everybody thinks it's a good idea. And there are, some, the Bible has a sort of a mixed view of dogs. They're viewed as unclean in some aspects of the Torah. But yet there's some evidence that scholars have unearthed of a dog burial in Ashkelon from 1200 CE. And the thought was that maybe they were being used as in rituals. So that gave them sort of a little bit more religious significance as sacrifices for the synagogue. So that it's a kind of a light article, but there's a serious discussion within about whether it's just frivolous or whether there's some serious aspect to it. And there was one rabbi, I think it was in Houston, as I recall, who just had a sort of a dog event at his synagogue, and 50 people came with their dogs, and they had an oneg, and he just thought that bringing this whole idea of caring for other creatures, and he thought it was a good thing to bring all the Jews and their dogs to this synagogue and worship together and respect the creatures of the world, I guess. So that's how the story came about. I think it's a great read, and I hope folks will find it online and read and enjoy it.
Well, another very interesting story in this issue takes us inside an insular community that not too many know about, Israel's small Domari population. The piece notes how the community struggles to survive, but is forging a new and a vibrant path for itself. Tell us about the Domari and why share their story?
Well, again, this is another story brought to us by a freelancer. And generally what I do is I send out an email to people who've contributed to us and just in general asking for proposals. And we get some really good ideas. And this was, I thought, one of them. And it's a small community of about, 1 or 2,000 people live in Eastern Jerusalem. And they came from the Indian subcontinent, something like 1100 Common Era, and I've been there ever since. And they're kind of the in-between people. They're not Arabs, and they're not Jews, and they actually face discrimination from the other parts of the demographic. And most of them are well educated. They don't get very far in school, and they struggle. And their main language is Arabic, but they are a subculture, if you will, and it shows partly shows the diversity of Israeli society, but also, there are some that are trying to become more educated. There's a Damari Center, and they would describe themselves as gypsies. They're sort of related to the Roma population in Europe. They don't regard that term as derogatory. So there's a Damari Center for Education, and the story leads with a 16-year-old Jerusalem high schooler who's attempting to wants to go into college and has professional ambitions, and it winds up being kind of an upbeat story. But to me, it just shows the diversity of the society, that it's not just two polar opposites. There are these other elements to it. And I think it's important for people to realize that. So that's the long and the short of it.
Yeah, well, it's a very interesting piece. Is there anything else that you'd like to tell us about the issue? It's packed with a lot of informative and interesting articles, but the magazine as a whole?
Well, yes, tip of the hat to Sho Kepler, who is our archivist, and she's a deputy editor, and she is institutional memory. And she writes articles for the magazine, but she also does the Vault column. And in this issue, she has a really interesting piece about a man named James Grover McDonald, who was was affiliated with the League of Nations High Commission on what to do about the Middle East, and the idea was to get all the countries behind this and kind of help resolve issues. And Germany didn't want any part of it, so he just went out on his own, and he solicited funds from different other members of the League, and he became a big advocate for the Jews, and then mandated Palestine, and denounced Hitler. In fact, in 1935, he resigned his position so that he could more openly attack what was happening in Germany. He wound up being the first American ambassador to Israel in 1948. And fascinating guy. I knew a little bit about him through another connection, but I think he's a person that most people don't know about. They should know about. And Cheryl did a really nice job of doing a little portrait of him. Plus, I should mention also, we have really informative and entertaining columns by our CEO Dan Mariaschin and the president. Now we have a different president, but that was also part of the issue. And we have a robust institutional section about what the organization is doing around the country. So just a few things.
You anticipated my closing comments here. The full disclaimer: I do have a regular column in B'nai B'rith magazine, as does our president, Seth Ricklin, which Gene just said. In 2023, B'nai B'rith celebrated 180 years of service to the world, for the Jewish community and beyond. Both Seth and I wrote about this 10 times high milestone, and we hope our podcast listeners will also seek out those stories in the 2023 winter issue. You can read the columns and all of the stories we discussed here today and more from the magazine on our website, bnaibrith.org. And with that, we're at the end of our time for this podcast. Thank you to my guest, Gene Meyer, editor of B'nai B'rith magazine, for joining us, and to you for listening to our show. Remember, the conversation doesn't end here. Share this episode with friends, post about it on social media, and leave us a comment or a rating. We love hearing from you. For all of our latest content, and if you haven't already, follow or subscribe to Conversations with B'nai B'rith wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, and of course, like us on Facebook. Stay tuned for more exciting content in our next episode. Until then, for my guest, Gene Meyer, this is your host, Dan Mariaschin. Take care, everyone.